All right, so in lesson 2, we're going to talk about development of the methodology memorandum that precedes the ACE study. Next slide. So the methodology memorandum itself is a technical memo that describes the goals of the ACE study and basically how we're going to intend to conduct the study. So it identifies your alternative corridors that you might want to look at eventually. It details the data and the process that the district will use to develop, evaluate, and screen the corridors. So one thing that it specifically gets into is the actual methodologies that will be used, the proposed public involvement, stakeholder outreach, and especially the criteria that we're going to use to form our basis of decision making. Occasionally, you will have a project that has a previous study that's already been completed. So in that case, it's a simple matter to refine the previous methodology memorandum. It's also important to remember that ACE studies do occur within the ETDM screening process. So that means that when you prepare the draft version of your methodology memorandum, then the lead agency and the ETAT team is going to offer comments, and they're going to review your draft memorandum. And so a great practice here is to coordinate with OEM when you're thinking about it. They are looking at all the statewide studies that are going on, and so typically they will probably be acting as the lead agency for a federal project that we'll talk about more in a little bit, but they might actually have some methodology memorandums recently that are very similar to a project like yours. So it's a great jumpstart for you. Next slide. Okay, so the first thing we do, of course, is conduct an initial preliminary screening through ETAT. This is before your methodology memorandum. This is to get your initial stakeholder comments and comments from the ETAT on the project itself, things to be aware of course. So as we're preparing for the methodology memorandum, the first thing we want to do is just review the initial work that we did prior to even sending out that first screening to the ETAT. So you will have gathered some data there. There might be some updates, of course, from the ETAT team and other stakeholders or the public that are coming in. One notable item here is that summary degree of effect rating that you receive from various categories from the agencies. Those are those values that are associated, like, I don't know, if you're in an endangered species area, is there going to be no impact, minimal, moderate, substantial, and there's even room for listing enhancements, that the project will be an enhancement to something. So let's not forget that as well. The biggie that we want to watch out for is whether agencies are identifying that there's going to be a potential issue with this project that will require future resolution, mitigation, whatever. And so we can look at these previous studies, we can conduct our updated GIS views, and then obviously a field trip is always a great idea. So in the ETDM manual, chapter 4, there are some guides to and a small outline, if you will, for the methodology memorandum, so you can look further there. And again, OEM, I think a great strategy here is to find some that have already been done, particularly good ones, right? Okay, next slide. So shown here are the high-level components that are found in the memo. We'll cover the details of each in a moment. So well, let's just move on to the next slide. Just go right into it. All right, so the first part, this isn't dissimilar from any environmental type document or study. We're going to have some background information. So we definitely want to have that adoption notice that FDOT intends to adopt this into the PD&E study. Yeah, that's a requirement for Pell. Then we have our NEPA assignment, the standard statement that you all are familiar with by now. So at this point, we want to talk about what the purpose of our project is, the purpose of the methodology memorandum, and giving a brief overview of the ACE process. This is where we just have our normal boilerplate contact information, we list our project description, and then we have some of the basic project information, as well as listing and documenting what some of those previous studies were. Let's move on. So now we're starting to get into the meat of it. When you're in your goals and objectives section. This is where you're establishing some of the analysis methodology and the framework, some of your key decision points that you anticipate that are then going to help you to establish a public and agency engagement strategy. A quick mention of project status is appropriate. In other words, where do things lie with previous studies or any previous ETAT reviews? Then we start marching into identifying the specific goals and objectives. It's important to remember that startup scenarios can vary, as Sylvia was talking about a little bit earlier. Thus, one has to consider where you're starting and where you're going to end, and with your goal determination. And those were those various scenarios in that scenario slide that she talked about. Next slide. Okay, getting to specifics. When we talk about the analysis methodology, here are some typical components that would be included. And these are the data needs, the actual corridor constraints that you might identify, considering and identifying your study area and refining that into corridors. What are going to be your criteria for analysis and evaluation, and your methods, as well as what is your approach to eliminating alternatives. So let's start diving into some of those a little bit. Data needs, this is the normal stuff that you're used to. This encompasses your spatial data and other information that are pertinent to developing the corridor. It's likely that you will be collecting the same type of infrastructure, natural environment features, human environment considerations. Of course, human environment often goes beyond spatial data, and that's talking with people. As well, are there any previous planning efforts with information that's already available? Your local governments can help you out here as well. And then are there going to be any required updates to help you with that information? So another primary data source here is obviously going to be that initial input that you get from ETAT on that first screening event, and as well from the public and any pertinent stakeholders for your project. Next slide. Okay, corridor constraints is definitely a big issue. It requires some judgment, but I think the best way to start talking about this is to offer you a definition. So corridor constraints represent the physical location of existing infrastructure, protected resources, and planned development. These can present substantial issues and thus challenges to the feasible selection of unidentified corridor. And so obviously this often means that we try to avoid or minimize impacts to these constraints. And so often we start with just identifying what your resources are in your project area. Not all of these are going to be project constraints. Certain resources will, if you will, they rise to the level of being an identified constraint where you see some big issues with hitting something. So some sources for these resources identification are going to be your preliminary environmental discussion, certainly the input that you get from ETAT or stakeholders. You might conduct further GIS, or Chris was talking about land suitability mapping. You have local government and stakeholders that are going to kick in. Particularly local government, I've found is very helpful to let you see things. As well, let's not forget to FDOT districts know the area better than anybody else. You've got the relationships out there. The Environmental Management Office obviously is good at the resource aspect, but I would say don't forget your planning staff. They're always working with your MPOs and your local governments. They often have advanced knowledge of particularly human environment areas. They might know where there are some minority or low income areas, just for an example. And finally, like we were talking about earlier, good old-fashioned field truthing is invaluable. So field trips are a great thing to consider. And often you precede that by a quick look at GIS data or aerial photos. Let's move on. So as we start to develop land suitability mapping or even constraint type mappings, certainly it's no surprise that spatial data is essential to this. It gives us our first sense of where things lie on the landscape. So here is where the FDOT Area of Interest tool provides that preliminary screening, and then you can go into more detail with other GIS efforts as well as coordination. So here's the fun part, I think. As you start to overlay all these resources, and particularly the ones that you call constraints, onto mapping, then the angels start to sing, right? And you start to see the promising locations for corridor alignments just begin to appear. And these are basically the areas on your map that are blank, that don't have a lot of shading or infrastructure on that. And then based on that, we can start to design our various corridor alignments based on the widths, of course, and then try to minimize the impact of those. So many resources are going to present obvious locations and boundaries. For example, if you see infrastructure, it's obvious where that is. Parks, historic architecture. Yet other resources out there are not going to have clear boundaries, or they might even have boundaries that change over time. This might be wetlands, wetland delineations, for example, or the known habitat of endangered species. And then one note of caution I'd put out there, a lot of you seasoned folks know this, is that, hey, it's easy to identify what's already on the land, but and what's above ground, but we also have to pay attention to utilities that are below ground, checking those out. We can see buildings, highways, railroads, waterways as examples, but we want to look further and even talk with any managing agencies that might have master plans that would present future development that we need to be aware of. The FDOT work program is a great example. That has future projects that are coming. Local master plans might have you might have a new mall coming in that you need to be aware of. So there's going to be the parking and the access. You might have a factory or even a big apartment complex. And there will also be other examples of unmapped features that are existing. For example, if you're close to an airport, there's a FAA restriction that's called a runway protection zone, which extends for several thousand feet from each end of a runway to protect the approaching aircraft from obstructions. And so that is an obvious and major developmental constraint on you. So a lot of the identification of what's not on mapping helps as well. Next. So now we're moving into identifying and refining our corridors. I don't want to steal thunder here. Sylvia is going to talk about this in lesson 3. This is the section where we talk about describing the corridors, how they were developed, how they meet purpose and need, and perhaps how they will be refined. So I'm going to punt that down line for Sylvia to talk about in lesson 3. As well, she's going to talk about our analysis and evaluation criteria. I'll give you a heads up on some of these. The methodology memorandum does need to describe the methods that will be used to develop alternatives, and then the criteria that we're going to use to appropriately evaluate each and hopefully eliminate some, right? So from the part 1 webinar, you will recall that specific planning and environmental linkage conditions are going to apply on the back end of your study to double check that the methods that you used were acceptable to your agency partners and that are appropriate for later incorporation to the PD&E study. So you've got to be very careful with method. So this description should cover how alternatives are going to be developed and then how alternatives will be evaluated. So some real quick ideas for evaluation criteria would certainly include whether they meet purpose and need. Are there any potential impacts to resources and infrastructure? Engineering feasibility, of course, cost, public and agency input or outcry, if you will, on some alternatives. Do you have local government support? And quite frankly, are your alternatives consistent with local plans? That could come to roost a little bit later on. Sometimes, in specific cases, we might consider constructability and phasing considerations. And then, as you can imagine, there's just a whole host of other aspects. And all these are unique to each project. So as well, your ACE study team might decide to use a corridor ranking system. Sylvia is going to cover this in lesson 3. But if that's the case, I'll give you the heads up that we do want to be consistent statewide with our agencies on how we do that. So this is a great opportunity to check in with OEM. They might have some recent successes to report, or maybe even some lessons learned from other districts. Next slide. So as we move on to eliminating alternatives, certainly we want them to meet purpose and need, and then we're going to use screenings, and we're probably in early stages going to use qualitative type comparisons and narrative assessments. And then as you start moving into further refinements, we might move toward qualitative measures, which, by the way, I'll tell you, have a less lengthy lifespan than others. So you got to be careful here. Sometimes you'll do quantitative measures during your ACE study. Sometimes you might wait for PD&E, and I think Sylvia is going to cover those more in detail. So I'll punt on that as well. So finally, we get into the public and agency input that should be described. This should include a coordination and public engagement meeting. In fact, one of our best practices that we're hearing from districts is it's a great idea to develop a public involvement plan as part of your process. It's essential for documentation, by the way, and this is a Pell requirement, just kind of like we have to do for PD&E studies. We have to, it's essential to document any of the comments that you received and show that you considered those before you make your final decisions. As well, I will tell you there are laws and regulations that require public engagement and an opportunity to comment at key milestones in your study. So something good for your back pocket. Moving on, next slide. Okay, so you work through this, you've got a draft methodology memorandum that you want to review. And so the first thing that we want to do is submit this to the lead agency for a 14-day review period. And then after any modifications that you might make, the methodology memorandum is then uploaded into the environmental screening tool for a second. So this is the second preliminary screen review by your ETDM team. And that's a 30-day review. And of course, one of the best practices that's been identified by districts is, hey, grease the skids before you perhaps send this to the lead agency for review. It's always a nice thing to set up a meeting and just walk them through the project with your draft methodology memorandum. Maybe they'll point out some things that you modify, and then you send in a slightly revised draft that's better, and it's gonna work better for them. Next slide. So we're then gonna get into the lead agency review. I want to pause for a moment and talk about lead agency. So for federally funded projects, and certainly under NEPA assignment now in Florida, FDOT acts as the lead federal agency. So the district project team would coordinate the methodology memorandum with the Office of Environmental Management. For state funded projects that are going to use a state environmental impact report, then the district itself is the lead agency. There could be some nuances here, so if you got any questions, OEM, again, is a great resource to help you. After the district uploads the memorandum for the ETAT and public review, then the comments are going to come in, so it's always helpful as well to have a follow-on meeting, if you will, with the lead agency to review and respond to any of those comments received. And certain situations might actually warrant that maybe there's some concerns, maybe ETAT has some questions, so there might actually be a second review of the methodology memorandum that you might want to conduct. In that case, it's often good to get up with OEM, particularly if they're the lead agency, right? And then think about a best approach. Next slide. So as we're moving toward approval of the methodology memorandum, when the lead agency itself, which might be you, is comfortable with the document contents and quality, then the memorandum is approved. And so then your district ETDM coordinator would republish the ETDM preliminary screening summary report that has the methodology memorandum attached. And then that essentially completes this step. And so now you have a solid and pre-coordinated plan in place, and now you're cleared to conduct the ACE study. So let's talk real fast about situations that come up with the next slide here. You could have some situations that require updates and basically a revision to your methodology memorandum. And so some of these reasons might be, for example, maybe there's a new technology or a new analysis method that you want to apply. Maybe your stakeholder input has changed, and that's prompted a change in method. You might have a revision to purpose and need, which is not at all uncommon. Changes to project termini, scope or concepts. Maybe you have a different number of lanes now based on a new traffic count or a newly identified interchange that is needed for that new mall, right, that you found. So you might as well have changes to supporting data. So whatever the reason is, changing a methodology memorandum is not something that you just do on the side. It requires a process. This is a process change, and it requires coordination with the ETAT. So in this case, a consult with OEM is really a good thing to think about, because they might have some lessons learned from others as well. Next slide. So to summarize, these are some of the best practices that we've found. It's beneficial to coordinate, pre-coordinate, if you will, with OEM on your analysis methodology, even before you start. We're hearing from districts that it's often a good idea to develop a traffic methodology and a memorandum, making sure that it's consistent with what you think you're going to do in PD&E for any updates. It is critical, we're hearing, to develop a public involvement plan, and like I said, establish those key milestones and making sure that you're touching base then. Because I will tell you, on the back end, those Pell conditions are very specific in that area. So this is an area to watch out for. It also, as I said, helps to grease the skids by holding those walkthrough meetings with your lead agency, maybe as the draft memorandum is about to be submitted to them, and then after you have some comments as well. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions. Pete?
Thanks, Ted. Okay. One of the things, Ted, that we've been asked is, can you expand on the lead agency review and approval process? Is that review done through the ERC? How is the official approval done? Email, signature page, signature authority? And if you're not that sure, I can take it as well. Actually, as I read it, I realized I know all that.
You're the man that handles those, so yeah, why not you?
Okay, all right. So the way that works is it's handled just like a normal approval. So the one thing to think about, Cesar, is that it's occurring within the environmental screening tool because it's part of the ETDM process. So when we share it out with partners, it's uploading a document. We're sharing it with the lead, just like we would do a pre-screening review on a project for all the alternatives and the purpose and need before it goes out for review. It's the same thing. Before the goes out and is vetted with everybody, it goes to the to OEM or the district, depending on who the lead is, where they just verify that it looks right. They would be sent a link to it, just like they would anything else. They get an email, it has a link, they have the ability to review it, they can provide feedback, and then ultimately there's a spot where they physically sign off on it, just like they would approve the purpose and need or anything else. So it's not done in ERC, it's actually done as an upload within the environmental screening tool. The way it goes out to the ETAT is the same way it goes to the lead, the same way they would do a class of action determination. It's the same activity. It's an email with a link with the information, review the information, there's a spot where they sign off on it. So that's mechanically how it works. And I'm not seeing any other questions. Does anybody have any? We'll give you guys just a few more minutes. One of the questions I did answer just a few minutes ago was just the idea of how do you balance between making sure that your alternatives meet the purpose and need versus the environmental impacts and avoidance and things like that. And really what we focused on was just the idea, and I just want to make sure you guys understand. Before the ACE process existed, already in regulation, you can already, ahead of PD&E, remove and eliminate alternatives that don't meet your purpose and need. We didn't develop the ACE process to eliminate alternatives that didn't meet purpose and need. You already had the mechanisms in place to be able to do that. If you want to be able to evaluate and eliminate an alternative for something other than it not meeting purpose and need, and you can establish that in your methodology memorandum, there's additional checks and balances and decision points and documentation points that have to happen, which is really the genesis of the ACE process in particular. It's got to be open. You got to develop a methodology. People have to have an opportunity to review the methodology. The methodology's got to be approved. Then you go apply the methodology. And as long as you apply the approved methodology as was stated and shared with everybody, then that gives you the ability then to see what can continue forward and what really should be eliminated. That provides the sufficient justification. And of course, you got to do that in all these coordinated ways, right? You got to share it with the public. It's got to go out to the stakeholders and all of those various things. And that's sort of the entire point of the ACE process, is recognizing we already have the ability that if something doesn't meet the purpose and need, we can eliminate it already. But it's for all those projects where we want to have another mechanism to potentially evaluate all our alternatives and eliminate one of them for something other than it not meeting the purpose and need, because we're assuming if you're in our process, it meets purpose and need, then you need to go through these extra steps, and that's developing the methodology memorandum, going through the process, documenting everything, getting approval, all the things we're covering today.
And, you know, one clarification there, Pete, I think we can never go light on meeting purpose and need. You always have to meet your purpose and need, or we shouldn't be carrying it forward. And certainly FHWA is not going to fund it if it's federal. So with that in hand, then to me, it becomes an aspect of, are we going to have a Cadillac project, or are we going to have to tighten our belt? If we're skirting the Everglades, for example, then we're going to have to consider reducing our cross section and tightening things. But that can have adverse effects. It can median width, for example, reduced median width can affect safety. And so that's where the balance occurs to me, is after purpose and need is achieved.